Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Panoptic Guardian Public Program within the frames of the National Uzbekistan Pavilion, the 59th Venice Biennial. It's my great pleasure to now hand over to my colleague, Andris Brinkmanis, to introduce today's program. Thank you so much.
Hello and welcome back, everyone. Today we are starting our public event with a very awaited meeting with Nomeda Gediminas Urbonas, who are artists, educators and co-founders of Urbonas Studio. And Urbonas Studio is an interdisciplinary research practice that facilitates exchange among diverse nodes of knowledge production and artistic practice in pursuit of projects that transform civic spaces and collective imaginaries. So they have exhibited all over the world, several times here in Venice, in São Paulo Biennale, Berlin, Moscow, Lyon, Guangzhou, Busan, Taipei Biennales, Folkestone Triennale, Manifesta Documenta exhibitions, and including numerous solo shows, and one of them was within the 52nd Venice Biennale. Then you've also participated in Venice Architecture Biennale with your Swamp Pavilion, which was quite recent. And both of them are affiliated with MIT. Gediminas is associate professor and Nomeda is a researcher both for ACT lab at MIT, which is Art, Culture and Technology program. So our talk is titled Swamp Observatory, Instrumentarium for a New Climatic Regime, which is presentation and questions and answers and a kind of dialogue we'll have during for the next hour or so. And I wanted to start maybe with just a brief introduction and then ask you, or kind of open our program with one little reflection. So when we were talking, you said that it is not easy to define a swamp even in biology, and that sometimes it seems it escapes the rationale of simple mathematics, and it is a very complex and multi-layered natural environment. So this term is frequently used also to characterize marshes, bogs, mires, wetlands, meadows and other gray zones between land and water. And in that sense, swamp, equally as desert, is a metonym for a variety of transitional ecosystems and functions. And this other forms of life, placing the swamp at the crossroad of disciplines and practices. So we will, this presentation will try to invoke that concept as a tool to address the vital urgency of human cohabitation with other forms of life, and we will be placing the swamp at the crossroads of disciplines and practices. A few days ago, I actually started with a presentation on the desert on Yinchuan Biennale, and now you are talking about the swamp, which is once again a kind of natural ecosystem. We're in the pavilion which is dedicated to Al-Khwarizmi, the mathematician polymath from the 9th century, whose name gives birth to the term algorithm that we are using today. And when we are speaking about algorithms, we are always thinking about technology, or we're thinking about the technology, and instead you will speak, or your speech will be will evolve around this natural ecosystem such as swamp. So maybe so that we could clarify why is this and what kind of relationship swamp in your case has also to the technology. And so let's maybe start from this, and then you can tell us the whole story, which is very rich, like from the swamp research and school that you have done here in Venice to your most recent kind of research and projects that are always in dialogue with this. And for you, swamp, I believe it's not just a metaphor, but it's also a source of research and inspiration. And maybe you can clarify why and how, and then I can continue to moderate, and then we will have some questions afterwards. Thank you. Do you have your mic?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Andris, for your introduction. And in this heat, we almost forgot where is the mic. Yes. And yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, thank you very much for such a thorough introduction and a very clear plan how we have to go on for the next hour. So maybe Gediminas, you will start.
Well, it is really a great pleasure to be in this pavilion, and really congratulations to everyone, to Uzbekistan, to the team of curators, Space Caviar. We feel that definitely, we were talking actually already in the Swamp School about the entanglements between the two seemingly so radically different ecosystem, extreme wet, which is swamp, and then extreme dry, which is desert. But as we found out during the process, that there are a lot of interesting similarities, precisely coming, from the plants. So it's just really great to be here, soaked in this not dryness but wetness, right? Like we paradoxically should be in the desert, but we are all sweating and contributing to this wet ontology, and also to be soaked in the smells, wonderful smells of plants, which I'm looking forward to find out what kind of plants are those. As the theme of this pavilion and the intellectual effort invites us to engage through the algorithmic thinking, we thought that proposal to discuss the swamp as the subject, and also as the point of departure, and also that leads us to the school, to pedagogical forms, and also to design, could be a good point, and we wanted to actually give you a bit of the insight of the 50s and 60s historical intellectual context in which the environmental thinking starts to germinate,
and maybe also which was very quite formative, I would say, for what we do now, for us, like personal as artists.
Yeah. So as Andris introduced, we are artists based at MIT, and of course, as we relocated to MIT in 2009, we started to dig into archives and also look into the rich history of environmentalism. And the founder of the Center for Advanced Visual Studies, which we are continuing under the new program, Art, Culture and Technology, was Georgi Kepesh, who was Bauhaus-trained artist, student of Moholy Nagy, and he did an intellectual breakthrough through the 50s and 60s with a series of the books Vision and Value. The three major pillars under which Center for Advanced Visual Studies was built were art on the civic scale, art on environmental scale, and art as communication. These ideas of the environmentalism emerges in the post-war America, when the artists, especially fleeing from the Nazis, relocating to the United States, on one hand they see the enormous inhumane scale destruction, that happened in Europe, right, in the Second World War. At the same time, they see the same enormous scale of pollution, which is incurred by the incredible speed and scale of industrial development that takes place in the United States. And within this context, the ecosystematic thinking, the concepts such as ecology, environment, and also cybernetics emerges as a way to kind of like deal with the what today we are calling modern human, right? How we can deal with this hyper object scale, kind of like with something that is incommensurable and cannot be really encompassed. So, and the first, and of course, mathematical modeling here plays very important role. So as we know, this blue marble image that is brought by the Apollo 11 mission, which had on board STAR, Star Computer Self-Testing and Repair, takes this first selfie of the humans, and of course, by extending the hand with American know-how into the space, and looking to the humankind. produces arguably a false image, right? Because what this image tells, and it is known as perhaps one of the most distributable images in the world, right? Everyone knows this image, right? But so it gives the false indication that everything can be understood and managed with the human know-how, right? Within this context, and this is quite interesting, also time in 2022 to speak about what was happening 50 years ago in 1972. So several slides, as you may notice, they have the 72 days. We're just totally fascinated about also this year. So operating manual for the spaceship Earth by Buckminster Fuller gives also idea of the planet as a spaceship Earth. Right, so of course it suggests that we are the travelers in the spaceship and we should take care. So therefore the manual suggests the ideas of taking care of the planet. But at the same time, it gives also a false idea that it is operable. That we are in power, like, with certain instruction, with certain knowledge, human knowledge and understanding how to manage this spaceship, we can maneuver it. Right, so we are in power to maneuver it. Within this also intellectual context, the Club of Rome report, Limits to Growth, is also built on this idea of mathematical modeling, right? So we can understand the limits. Of course, before this report, humanity driving into the progress, regardless on which side of the Iron Curtain, given the Cold War confrontation. They were thinking that resources are bottomless, right? They could pollute ocean, rivers, and lakes, endlessly, and extract whatever is needed in terms of resources endlessly. So, limits to growth gives the indication, and through the mathematical proof, and some of the people who were involved. Such as J. Forrester, for example, mathematicians and cyberneticians, they gave the mathematical proof about the limits of the resources and also about our responsibility, which again was finally sort of like sealed, the responsibilities, in the Stockholm Conference, United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. Right. So there, 50 years ago, for the first time, humanity states, that rivers cannot be polluted. They do have a right to stay unpolluted, and also responsibility of the humanity to transfer to the forthcoming generations ecosystems, places, and resources, as not exhausted so sort of like the idea of what you found, you should transfer to the forthcoming generations. So that we could say scientific and intellectual context also foregrounds much of the artistic endeavors, and I don't want to say that artistic endeavors comes kind of like as almost as a reflection of that. I think they both kind of like developing in parallel, in dialogue, or what we could say in entanglement with each other, and here the arts and of the environment, edited volume that is edited by Georgi Kepes, plays very important role as it brings few people that I mentioned like J. Forrester, but also artists like Robert Smithson and Leo Marx, sociologist, anthropologist, political theorists, together to discuss the role of arts that engages environment. This is 72. This is just 2 years after the officially Earth Day, was celebrated. This is the same year Stockholm Conference takes place, and Club of Rome report is published. Just to kind of like settle this also cultural, political context, few of the exhibitions, such as cybernetic serendipity that takes place at ICA in London, that among others also bring Architecture Machine Group with Nicolas Negroponte from MIT, and including also John Cage, and many other cultural producers. Another important exhibition happens at the Jewish Museum, the software show, where again we have Nicolas Negroponte, and we have also other artists actually developing works that actively engage algorithmic machinic thinking with idea. And here I would quote Georgi Kepes, who says that artists are living seismographs, as it were, with special and direct sensitivity to the human condition. Their immediate and direct response to the sensuous qualities of the world helps us to establish an entente with the living present. And of course, how artists are establishing this entente, not just kind of like, with their bodies, right? But with their artworks, with the artworks that are designed, that are produced with the help, by either hacking or either recombining technological apparatuses. So here the critical and performative approach plays very important role. And there are also interesting precedents that I realized at that time. For example, like Pepsi Pavilion, which also is endeavor that has behind Experiments in Art and Technology, or EAT, who are also behind the 9 Evenings, and Merce Cunningham, John Cage, and many other artists are part of this extraordinary endeavor that models the architecture as a cybernetic apparatus. That's something that can sort of like take the impulses from the outside, feed them into the system, and create a feedback loop between what is outdoors and what is indoors. So without going much into this, because it's recently has been wonderful books published about this, but our interest is to really look into the precedents that kind of like contribute to the cybernetic thinking, through the architecture or art, as in the case of Hans Hake, who also inspires to coin this term system aesthetics, right? As in this case, the gallery piece takes the piece is called Rhine Water Purification Plant, takes the polluted water from the extremely polluted Rhine River, which at that time, just started to sort of like started to be cleaned, so you can see all the black, all the dark sort of like matter in the corner in those vessels, so you can see what sort of like takes to purify the water until the livable condition for the life to thrive. So the emergent ecosystem ecology, and here we have the term that is inspired by the Eugene and Howard Odum, brothers Odum, ecology thinkers, also system aesthetics, Jack Burham, Hans Hake I mentioned, and also Felix Guattari with free ecologies. These sort of like, these concepts are interchange and also add to each other, right? So here, what is interesting in Odum's thinking, that still in their vocabulary, they are borrowing many terms from the electric circuits, So we find it really inspiring, their work, because this is an attempt sort of like almost like to merge these two grids, the electric circuitry, almost like seeing the energy exchanges in the natural environments, and then merge it with the natural environment with the fluid dynamic, which is kind of like a really paradoxical example, because like, we obviously see, especially after 50 years, that this merger is not working, but it is a paradox that one had to embrace in the 70s, And much of this language, especially that comes from electric circuitry, perhaps needs to be rethought and reestablished. And this is what we see also in the work of Keller Easterling. So, as we are working also on the book Swamps and the New Imagination, Andrew Pickering, who is also a historian of science and also STS scientist, based in UK, he is contributing with his essay Swamp Ontology, and that is exactly where we're entering perhaps the argument of this talk, of this contribution to the panopticon garden and to this thinking on algorithmic thinking, which is sort of like debate between the dry and the wet ontologies, right? We argue that the dry ontology that are represented through the first order cybernetic, starting with Norbert Wiener, and the followers, sort of like needs to be rethought, and therefore wet ontology or the swamp ontology, as in the case of Andrew Pickering's take, could be quite useful. So basically, well, you can read on the screen, but perhaps I will just read along with you that empirical basis of the objective science has thus nothing absolute about it. Science does not rest upon solid bedrock. The bold structure of its theories rises above a swamp like a building erected on piles, driven down from above into the swamp. So here Andrew Pickering quotes Karl Popper from the 30s, and I think also philosopher Price was also, who was working at the time in Boston. He was also quite obsessed about wetlands and about swamps, also thinking of its relation with with science, with kind of like human knowledge, right? So call for the wet ontology is sort of like is not kind of like nostalgic look for the pre-modern times, but it is a call to find a connection between the two ontologies. And Gordon Pask and also Stafford Beer, who were Manchester cyberneticians, they were studying natural systems, wet estuaries, and also ponds, as they found in them most complex environments. They said that if we look at the underwater plants, at the fish, at the fluids, at the mud, also at the air, at the insects, we have the most complex. We have the most complex system. So if we could design the coupling with this most complex system, with the complex man-made environments like the factory or a firm, we could perhaps manage this much more better, right? So this thought of the external brain, right? Something that could expand the brain capacity, and also thinking of the interface that could plug the human body or the human environment with the natural environment emerges within this cybernetic thinking. And one of the perhaps most known cases is Stafford Beer commission for the Allende government in Chile, a project that was proposal for the project that was realized between 71 and 73. So again, 72 is a year in the middle, and here you can see the design for the control room of the cyber scene computer that is designed to actually manage the entire economy, distribution, supply system of Chile, of entire country, right? Of course, it was very forward, revolutionary proposal. There was sort of like it was not realized, and as you know, coup d'état in Chile disrupted this plan, right? So the project was never finished. For us, it is also interesting to see where the cybernetic lineage of thought, that starts, in 60s, sort of like continues in 70s, also meets a thought in developmental biology, that looks into the origins of life, and here we have hot springs as also one of the sites that were researched by such scientists as Lynn Margulis. Or also an image that suggests other planets, like in the work of Tarkovsky's Solaris, the planet that is capable of not only to give other forms of life, but to generate these phantoms, to generate some kind of like imagination. And in both cases, like in these hot estuaries or in Solaris, we have this sort of like kind of like messy, muddy, fluctuating mass, that is impossible to sort of like really translate to or measure or sort of like to really grapple with it, right? So sort of like it always awaits from any kind of like measurement and any kind of like rationalization. Some of the artists like Robert Smithson and also Juan Downey were also interested in these ideas of entropy and also ideas that could speak of some rationality within the irrational, something that can construct and produce spaces without the tangible materials. So this brings us to another argument on the autopoiesis versus sympoiesis, as these were the very important concepts that are emerging in the 70s. And here, with the help of Lynn Margulis, that I mentioned, developmental biologist, who comes with the endosymbiotic endosymbiotic theory that suggests that something new emerges not from kind of like following this Darwinian logic of that one sort of like the survival of the fittest when one emerges out of another, but something new emerges out of the entanglements, out of the combination of the two, right? So here she is basically saying that to be eaten, to change, and to cooperate. Right, so not to eat another one, and not to sort of like conquer another one, but to be eaten, to change and to cooperate, and this symbiopoietic proposal is a metaphor that could be tested. That something totally new emerges from this proposal. To cooperate by necessity, as also as extension of other metaphors that are describing relationships among art, science, and technology, such as proximity or entanglement. So here we have this sort of like proposition. Now this is what you can see on the screen, how the cyanobacterium, which we can find in these hot springs, or hot volcanic sort of like sites, are basically can sort of like prove how the life forms are emerging, right? So here is a chart of the two systems, and I don't know how much you are familiar with this with the similarities and differences, but we thought also to insert here because we found that sympoietic, the drawing on the sympoietic system could be quite useful for the swamp school. So yeah, we could just like simply go maybe for the main characteristics, that speaks of the distributed center, right? So in the sympoietic system there is no sort of like main center out of where everything is emerging. So it speaks about the boundaries. It speaks also about the relationships between the center, between the periphery, and actually it abolishes the center, the sympoietic system. Okay, so maybe we were thinking that maybe this kind of like historic introduction could help us to settle our interest in the swamp. and in the pond. And in this case, we're invited in 2017 to make a proposal for the National Pavilion of Lithuania in Venice Architecture Biennial. We said that we really want to develop pavilion that takes on this on the wet ontology, sort of like as the opposed to the dry ontology, and considers pavilion as a school. So considers school as a form, right? So therefore there is a swamp school. Would you, Nomeda?
Okay, I will try to VJ and also comment a little bit. So, yes, as you see, as maybe also Gediminas didn't mention, but swamps are quite unruly. They have a tendency to leak, to disobey, to ignore the boundaries or the edges, yeah? So, but at the same time, yes, going to this cybernetic model and drawing on, you know, Stafford beers and all the others that Gediminas just was trying to mention, in a way it is a system. So we were also kind of struggling between those two paradigms, trying to structure the swamp school, but at the same time keeping it very open and loose and yeah, just open for the other inputs. And as you see here, around there are like main, let's say, themes or topics or keywords that were quite important in thinking and organizing the school, like hybridity and ephemeral, amphibian, affect, transversality, micropolitics, rhizome or rhizomatic thinking, and action, and becoming. So we kind of like trying to situate the school within these modes. And then the structure of it, we will perhaps explain a little bit later, or we'll just show through the many different slides and projects how we structured it.
So our first question that many people asked was, why the swamp? Why you're not calling forest, for example, or wetland, you know, or of course swamps have many names: mires, quagmires, fens, bogs. But what we were interested in the irritant aspect, right? Perhaps it also coincided with the political rhetorics that were circulating at the time, 2016, 2017, especially during the elections in the United States. At the time, also we started to look into other cultures, other historical contexts, how the swamps were always compared with hell, right? Or with something that needs to be drained and needs to be tamed. And so this ecosystem that's been long maligned, neglected, and also extracted, we thought that could be really important for us to sort of like almost like to well, on one hand you could say rehabilitate, right? You know, but on the other hand, our interest to find something that leaks all the time out of the human control and always brings new aspects and whether we're talking about the sea level rising or whether we're talking about you know, political rhetoric, there is something that is always slips out of the control of the human. Of course, with the school and what we're calling swamp pedagogy, right? We were focusing on the emerging knowing, right? So somehow through the emergence as epistemology and also looking into temporal habitats, also nomadic learning, you know. So given again the not only the character of the swamp as the ecosystem, but also looking at those cultures and and those life forms, including indigenous knowledges that found their hideouts and the refuge in the swamp. And here, we can look at the histories of the Great Dismal Swamp or the Black Swamp in the United States. We could look also in many other situations across, Europe, and Africa and Asia and other places of the world. Of course, as the places of extraction, the swamps, they had always very problematic relationship with the architecture and with the urbanism. So for us to think about the architecture, given that this is architecture biennial context, was also to think, to use the swamp almost like a lens for which we can think about materiality of architecture. And we could challenge also materiality of the architecture, thinking beyond the visual, thinking beyond the oral, and thinking beyond the known.
Okay, so since we are coming from Lithuania, and the invitation also came from the young architects in Lithuania, we were lucky to find this amazing source, so-called Bible of the Swamps, which is the monograph written by the German botanist Karl Albert Weber, who actually visited former Prussia, or nowadays it's a territory in Lithuania, a swamp called Aukštumala, or it's rather a peat bog. And he did like a first scientific study, like a first in the world officially called scientific study of that type of swamps, and developed the methodology how to like really read it and how to understand it, with all the very slow growth of the plants and different optical phenomena which happen there, and also a relationship between the soil and the air and how it affects the plants and different shapes of them. So these are all scientist drawings, and that was a source of inspiration for us. And also we invited young architects for the first exercise in that particular swamp in Aukštumala, an exercise of instability.
That sound is beautiful, so it's okay. We don't need additional sound. So in Karl Albert Weber's contribution to the science, of course, was also kind of like twofold. On one hand, he was the first as a botanist to observe the different types of plants that contribute to the different types of peat. Because before him, people thought that all peat was kind of generic, right? But he did that for the better colonization of the land, because he was sent to this expedition, to 3-year expedition to that swamp in Lithuania that was at that time part of the Prussian Empire, and the Germans or the Prussians needed scientific grounding for better colonization. So his book, on one hand, provides that grounding, with classification of what is useful, what kind of types of peat you could extract and where. But at the same time, also laments on the unavoidable destruction of the environment. So this kind of like twofold, almost like a pharmacon, kind of like the poison and the remedy at the same time. This kind of like quality actually helped this book to remain very important source of understanding, and at the same time fascination and also responsibility, almost until now. Yeah, it remains the main volume. So speaking of the methodology, for us was important sort of like to draw on this book and on specific site for the school. So the school is not just kind of like abstractly relating to the swamp, it's kind of like abstract idea, philosophical idea or cultural idea, but it is grounded on the site. And at the same time, another site was here in Venice, as the school was in Venice, and what we also found through the research, that there was an existing collaboration between the two universities, one in Klaipėda and one in Venice, and the researchers of the fluid dynamics, researchers of the meteorology, researchers of geology, researchers of underwater plants were collaborating already between these two ecosystems. We curated or conceptualized the swamp school in 3 chapters: Swamp Radio, Futurity Island, and the Communism. Each chapter was also produced in dialogue with our partners, collaborating partners from different schools, including NABA with Andris and Marco Scottini, who were also interlocutors. We had interlocutors for each of the chapters, and then within the chapters were interlocutors. Altogether, more than 300 participants coming from several countries and several universities. So we will not do justice, really introducing all of them, but we try just to sort of like, for the sake of this presentation, to pull out several. First, we will start from the swamp manual to give idea how, again, alluding to these manuals from the 70s perhaps, and also to the manuals that Jonna Friedman was also designing, as part of his people's architecture project. We kind of like suggested that each participant could have their own entry, which can be easily used and deployed as a poster, and at the same time give the participants of the school very succinct idea of what could be doable. And as we term that, as public interfaces that could engage the audience, meaning audience not only in the Biennale, but also audience participants of the Swamp School, and also Venice people, right? We should not forget that Venice has a great audience, the inhabitants of Venice. So the manual had the general introduction consisting again of 3 parts: swamp modernity, swamp as pedagogy, and also what we call swampian artists, or artists who represent hybrid practices. So for example, Juan Downey, who spent several years working in Amazonas and living with Yanomami people, he argues for the invisible architecture, right? So architecture that could be achieved through the invisible means, through the daily gestures, through connecting to plants, to fish, to bodies of water, to the airflow, and through the daily gestures, maybe sounds and words, and maybe just what you have at hand, like a stone or a piece of wood or branch, you could actually produce spaces. So we found that this could be very important for us to also rethink architecture and get out of the habits of thought in the architecture education. So the first chapter, the Swamp Radio. You would like to continue?
Yeah, so of course, as I mentioned, the borders between even chapters in the school are difficult to find. So of course, they kind of like, mingle, and but in general, we could say like the first chapter was focusing on transmission and
listening. And again, here, we have the interest to bring these role models, as alluding in general to Juan Downey's practice, and here to Marianne Amerscher, who is electronic music pioneer, Also, artists who inquired as a researcher, as a scientist, also working at MIT, inquired psychoacoustic phenomenon, something that could be sort of like constructed within your hearing apparatus. Then also we had several of the theoretical contributions, like from Beatrice Colomina and Mark Wigley, who argue for the human as insect. As we gradually using our cell phones and smartphones, we on the daily basis we're looking for food, we're trying to look for the habitats, trying to find our way through the cities. Thus, Mark Wigley argues that we are gradually becoming like insects. Biotricity lab that was also developed by Rasa Smita and Raitis Smits, Latvian artist, living now in Germany. They were looking at the geobacter capacity, bacteria that could generate electricity, and how that sort of like, so seeing again capacity, not only thinking of the battery invention or the production of the energy using life forms, but what was fascinating for us in this thinking, thinking of the swamp as the electric circuitry, thinking of the swamp also almost as a brain, that could sort of like, through the biochemical exchanges could generate the exchanges of the information and information transfer. So the connection between the battery and the radio here is also important. And we have Chilean artist Nicole Hulier, who is working with Mapuche ways of listening to the environment and constructing hybrid radio. Sending laguna signals or swamp signals in the radius of 3.5 kilometers, basically that covers the central island of Venice lagoon. And perhaps also suggest an entirely different perspective and the image of Venice, like sort of like decenter it, from the perspective of lagoon. Also different ways of listening to the environment. For example, Jana Winder, a Norwegian artist who uses different technological apparatuses that help humans to hear beyond the human range of listening. Or Sam Aunger, who is actually refusing any technological apparatuses and instead suggests participants to use their limbs to listen to the environment, right? So listening through the body as one of the indigenous ways of kind of like also connected to the roots of the trees, like mangrove trees, and listening to, or using the tree roots, listen to the fish or listen to other species. So here, of course, there is a question about the pavilion and about the participants. From the inception, we wanted to have a pavilion that is distributable, that can really spread across Venice, across all the lagoon, and find its interest in different spots and be recombinable. So here the swamp ponchos are suggested for the architecture participants, so they can wear their proposals, their architecture designs, and reconstitute them at a given space, at any given space and time. And of course, this reaction for the pavilion that is not situated, that could be distributable, comes also as a reaction to the giardini that has a status quo of the geopolitical constellation, like sort of like the map that was basically developed at the end of the 19th century and insists on certain constellation of power, on certain status quo of power that cannot be destabilized, So therefore we found the fascination in the swamp as this kind of like unruly and also disobedient device or vehicle, if you will. The Futurity Island had, that is another chapter, had contributions that are directly dealing with the idea, topological idea of the swamp and the island, these two relationships, which is really very important in Venice, and perhaps you already experienced Barena today, right? So you learn about this term of Barena. So the several contributions here, they are in very directly dealing with the idea of growing the swamp, and also looking at different materials that grow in the swamp and grow in Barena. And yeah, I think we mentioned Jonna Friedman and his manuals, but I think here the inspiration is being developed into the specific island, or in this case the open form workshop that suggests building amphibian house, Casa Amphibia, special workshop designed for the children of Castello area. Like Via Garibaldi is very local street, this is between Arsenale and Giardini, perhaps some of you were passing by, and you can see children playing there every day. And there is also a playground not far away, and they're looking for also for different sites of engagement, and typically biennial, is considering a certain age group and certain audience, and overlooks what children could do, right? So again, for us, was interesting to think of to offer yet another aspect of the swamp, which is the playground, whether swamp could become a playground, and whether playground could be part of the pavilion strategy as well, So building the amphibian house was this exercise performed on Saturdays and Sundays for several hours, and local children could be just left there, or the parents could also observe them playing. The infrastructure of the pavilion of the headquarters, eventually we had to kind of come to this uneasy decision. Our first decision was just to spread a school across Venice Lagoon, but we had to accept the impossibility of such endeavor, because there is climatic condition, and we all feeling perhaps much more comfortable in this place than being under the sun, for example, or under the rain, which could be worse, right? So the headquarters of the school were installed in the Via Garibaldi, and the only element of the infrastructure that we were using to build the infrastructure for the school was the pipe. So in this case, pipe was recombined in the different ways to allow also channeling of the sounds, of the smells, as we gradually were accumulating this library of sounds and smells. Yeah, so maybe we can skip maybe that Helen and Newton Harrison's, we had several historic role models. So yeah, Juan Downey, Marian Amersher, Jonna Friedman, Ellen Houghton Harrison. But with these historic models, with these examples of practice, we're also looking into ways how we can build commonalities, and how the hybrid practice can be articulated. And here was the fragment of the swamp that was reconstituted in one of the courtyards. So that was a collaboration between the designers, architects, and the scientists who are involved in bioremediation, in restoration of the wetlands and restoration of the raised peat bogs. And here the experiment was whether in the extremely different climatic condition which Venice is, those plants from the north and those ecosystems could also survive, and also what we were interested in building the digital model of this environment, and sort of like looking at the relationships of different plants. The Campo Alto, that's another island that is known as the place for the garbage accumulation. That's how this island was formed. NABA students, participants from NABA, they spend several weeks or even months constructing this clandestine intervention, this in the form of archive, looking at what we know as plastic agglomerate, as a type of new geology. That is, the term that's suggested by the scientists. So already in the museums of natural history, you can find these new constellations called plastic agglomerates that speak to the assemblies of the life forms and man-made things. Also, group of participants from MIT, they were looking at the tourism industries and also artifacts that they bring to the island and arguably making this island sink. We know this Grande Navi and actions organized, reflecting of tourism and looking into how the tourism industries and also Airbnb industries are actually affecting the ecosystem of Venice and life of local people. So the Venetian souvenir, or this anthropic souvenir, that was utilizing the sapone con rosa, the old Venetian recipe, and as we know, Venetian Republic was very known for its soap recipes, spreading it across the Venetian Republic, different other islands in Mediterranean and further. And here this pedagogical engagement with the audience was suggesting not only how to learn making soap, but also how the ingredients in the soap could reflect the pollution of Venice. So participants were collecting garbage found in the National Pavilion. So maybe we could also look here around. It looks very clean, because we just saw a member of the staff cleaning this floor. So, but if we look at different national pavilions, perhaps we could find something. And that something would land as a memory in the soap, and then the soap would again be distributed in the bathrooms of the pavilions. Making new land that looks into actually Salicornia and how the Salicornia as the magic plant was not only used in making of the glass in Venice, but also as this magic plant that contributes to the accumulation of the sand and debris, and gives the condition for the land in the lagoon. So that's how originally the islands formed in Venice Lagoon. Also collaboration with Maria Tisa Potrch and her students from Hamburg Art Academy directed our attention at the Homeless People Association in Venice, and also vernacular methods of building and also building technology and also repairing of the old houses in Venice. As we know, for the building industries are one of the most polluted industries, and how could we find a replacement for those chemically produced materials with the natural maybe materials found in the Barenas, found across Venice. So this was one of the questions, and here is the third chapter, communism. Maybe Nomeda could continue.
Yeah,
Contribute to communism.
which is important not to mix with communism. So communism is about the commons, and the interlocutor with whom we worked, Nico Dox and Pascal Guerlin, they also published the book with the same title at the same time, and we had a book launch at the headquarters. So it was, of course, very much about the common space and how do we as humans could create that, and the invitation to several of the participants was extended to more and more in a kind of almost geometrical progression. So we ended up with, I don't know, maybe 250 people in that chapter. So we barely knew who they are and they didn't know each other. So this was like also how do we are together, and of course in these circumstances the performative gestures. Maybe you just give it the performative gestures and the interfaces and exercises involving, different people easily are the most successful. So maybe I just quickly go through it. And of course, the food, food for commons and food for life. It's another interface by NABA students, the group of NABA students, where they emphasize the importance of local knowledge in food production. And here we see Salicorni again, and we also are very lucky to get some of it from today's first part of the day's visit to the island.
Yeah, so some of these contributions also coming as in the form of kombucha. So here you can see Rikri Travanija, who comes from via Pelintan, and also series of recipes for the soup kitchen. That was also a special form conceived by the group of the Antwerp Art Academy students. They were cooking for the entire chapter of the communism. So they were running this soup kitchen, and the participants, after the long day of being in the field and the workshops and the sessions and meetings, would convene in the evening for the soup experience.
And in the discursive events, the situation would be like slightly similar to this, I think, when you have some particular sound in the background, and you have to like always be in dialogue with it.
Just instead of this like nice electronic sounds, you would hear like someone chopping carrots or potatoes or celery. So yeah, you would perhaps need also to think how it is in attunement to what you're saying, and perhaps that gave also the certain tempo how you're speaking.
Can I ask you maybe then, while we are seeing the last part of shortly after this, actually something unexpected happened, because there was also the pandemic, and the closure. You then came up with the swamp game, which was instead because this was all done in presence with a lot of people involved. So maybe then we could pass how you arrived from this particular kind of experience, also to elaborate what you then. I think now it's also available through the website that we can see afterwards, and maybe how you sort of from that experience then ended up in the virtual reality.
Yeah, we could transition to the swamp game. So there were maybe few things. Maybe we could like briefly show Nomeda this tour fiction, maybe because it somehow relates. Okay. So around 2016, we started a collaboration with Icelandic artists who try to rehabilitate autochthonous house, torf house in Iceland that was eradicated during the second half of the 20th century modernization of Iceland. The torf house is arguably the best house that could secure well-being of Icelandic people living in this extreme wet, windy, and cold condition. And as you can see, it has either the wooden structure or the stone, and has the turf on the roof. The group of anthropologists, historians, artists, and also including the French biologists spent 3 years researching what really constitutes that healthy condition. And you can see here the chart of the torf house microbiome. So it's almost like making the parallel like with architecture that is surrounding our body, and microbiome that is kind of like in our body, like our intestines. But this is sort of like the external intestine, right? And you can see the bacteria and the eukaryotes, sort of like, and even they found the new species that were unknown. But this is what arguably constitutes this well-being of the body living in the extreme environments. So yeah, so we are very much interested in this. Maybe Nomeda, you can. Could you show that Tidmarsh project? So the Torv House was one of the projects that we maintained the relationship building the swamp school. Another one is the Tidmarsh. This is also restoration of the former peat bog that was converted into the cranberry farm end of the 19th century. And 10 years ago, they were trying to bring it back to this kind of like pre-Columbian condition. And this project contains more than 600 sensors that are in the real time measuring the condition of the water, condition of the soil, condition of the air, condition of the plants, also insects, and recording the birds and everything, and tries to feed it into computer and analyze it and develop the three-dimensional model out of that data in order to really understand how effective our remediation processes are. Right, so again, getting back to this cybernetic thinking, yes, we're producing these feedback loops, but then, analysis of these feedback loops and what kind of like impact it really has on the environment, So driven by these ideas, we started to also articulate swamp intelligence and also swamp as the epigenetic landscape. So this project was. This project, if you can go a little bit up, it was part of the critical zones, observatories of the earthly politics, the exhibition that was created by Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel at ZKM. And as many people knew this exhibition, but nobody saw this exhibition because exhibition was supposed to open during the pandemic. Suddenly pandemic started and exhibition didn't open. And because of this, several artists were asked to develop the digital propositions or digital forms of their projects. So our project was constituting Swamp Observatory. And as Andris now asked to jump into the swamp game, so we will jump into the swamp game.
Yeah, but basically the swamp game also in a way grew out of this idea of the swamp intelligence and our kind of hopeless attempt to mark and register all the bacteria and algae and birds and mammals and mushrooms and fungi and plants and insects and many other categories and species together with a biologist. So in a way it is based on the real data taken from that swamp, like first the swamp which was first scientifically studied in the world, Aukštumala swamp. So we continued collaboration with the botanist and biologists working there, and we gathered the data, and in an online version of this research, let's say, we have a swamp game. It's again, maybe not a game, it's a experience, online experience, but we just like this combination of swamp game of these two words.
So Nomeda, could you play us the game? Do we have a sound?
Yes, we do. Later.
Okay.
So just read. So the main idea of that swamp game is based on the also idea of, you could say, Lin Margulis, but in order to survive, you have to be eaten. So the logic here is not like to escape or to run away or to hit and eat someone else, but just to like relax and maybe go with the pace of the game and with the speed of the game and yeah, just meet the creatures and be eaten by them. And yeah, by that you would change your perspective and you would become, for example, algae. So suddenly the color scheme changes and the scale definitely changes and the sound also changes. I don't know if you hear it. Bell, maybe, yeah, it could be a bit higher on maximum, sorry. But yes, so there are all these like different saturations of colors, for example, slime mode now, and definitely different scales and different speed, which allows you to go through the swamp, through the space. Amphibian. The plant doesn't allow you to go almost at all, for example.
So this messy and irritant swamp gives us opportunity to test the idea of sympoiesis, collectively forming and becoming together in order to find new ethos of coexistence, a way that recognizes poetical and political power of ecologies all around us. So with the Swamp project, the Swamp game and the Swamp Observatory and the Swamp School, and we call it the Swamp project, with the Swamp project, we are probing concept of social biotop as a new way to engage current and future citizens. And also as we're working on the several projects that also engage sustainability in the urban environment. We work with architects and planners. We are also considering pedagogical interventions and the process of collective artistic co-creation that could catalyze our imagination for new commonalities, new sensitivities, and new relationships with living and non-living matters around us. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much. Right, so thank you, and maybe I can open up the floor to the questions, and we could start a little discussion. Thank you. It was a fantastic presentation and very long and detailed. And I wanted to ask you one thing. You mentioned, like in the swamp game, there is a word like that you use, that we are in Gaia, and I think you refer also to this term invented by Lynn Margulis and by also James Lovelock, and he was, I'm having his most recent book, but he was saying that, for example, one of the interesting things is that when you think of an ecosystem, a complex ecosystem such as a swamp, that and other what he calls dynamic self-regulating systems, he says that they wholly defy the logical explanation that uses step-by-step arguments, which is how science and how we are used to think. So was this also an attempt, like sometimes to actually visualize and or really to find a way how we can talk about these phenomena, because they're so complex that our kind of logic is too narrow to grasp them. So and I think your practice is somehow very kind of multidisciplinary, but in the end you find different ways of how to aesthetically sort of articulate also these very complex issues that deal with science, as we just saw, for example. So is it a kind of deliberate attempt to work towards an elaboration of this kind of also aesthetical way how you could approach these questions?
You know, one thing that we didn't mention from our collection of 72, you know, fascination about specific year 72, is a grassland project, you know, that was attempt of the research university to really understand relationship between the animals grazing on the grasslands. Therefore, it was called grassland. So the students, PhD students and professors spent 3 years going after cows, calculating every insect and every, you know, measuring every cow shit and looking into the worms and looking into the plants, what they were eating, when they were eating, you know, and sort of like taking all the data into the computers of the time, you know. And after enormous resources, endless hours of the 3 years, they realized that they could not actually understand how the system worked, because to understand how the system works, someone would need to look into the intestine of the cow in the real time, you know, while they were eating, right? And look what kind of like enzymes were produced, what kind of like chemical processes were happening in the guts of the cow, in their brain, you know, and so on and so forth, you know. So they reached this state, you know, of something that is called uncomputable, right? And what we are trying to do with these experiments in the Swamp School, which tries to sort of like engage the audience and tries to engage different materialities, and also think of the translation between the data to the pedagogy, is also grapple with the space between something that could and could not be computable, right? You know, so it is so we don't want to say that you know, one or the other, right? But we could say that we need some kind of like dialectics where we should somehow paradoxically be able to embrace both simultaneously, or negotiate with both simultaneously. Maybe don't need to embrace, but somehow find a form of negotiations. So in a similar ethos of Karl Popper, you know, suggestion, you know, or what Andrew Pickering is kind of like bringing also through his essay to the Swamp book, Swamp Ontology, is sort of like to connect those two ontologies, you know, connect sort of like the science as we know, as it is built, this kind of like Cartesian sort of like vision, you know, the Enlightenment, you know, not completely reject it and denunciate and sort of like go back to the pre-Columbian swamps, right, you know, or but at the same time trying to find a connection with all the knowledge that was extracted, you know, all the witchcraft, you know, all the queerness, all the sort of like hybridity that was completely impossible for the modernity to deal with, you know, that was extracted, that was expelled, that was exterminated, right, and not considered human, right? So finding the way to kind of like negotiate with those two ontologies, that way we would see sort of like the potentiality of this.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you so much, Urbonas, for your presentation. It was wonderful, very rich. I feel the way in which you look at the swamp as a sort of critical aggregate, it's fascinating as a sort of alternative topography, if you like. Something I was thinking about while you were speaking was the sort of relationship between the swamp and the bayou, particularly in the context of American history, and these ideas that you just pointed out, these ideas around alchemy, magic, voodoo that existed within certain topographies in the United States, within the South, that were part of this indigenous knowledge, part of these indigenous practices. Have you incorporated some of these ideas within your research, I wonder?
Okay, yes, so as you see, we are like absolutely fascinated with the networked cultures and with the things which are like really rhizomatic and are endless. So then at some point, you know, whenever presentation mode comes, it's very difficult to choose the right ones and to edit. So of course, many things which we would love to be included in the presentation are left outside. So I think these particular references were not in this case or in this particular presentation. So yes, of course, the dismal swamp is like definitely one of the very most maybe important examples which is supposed to be here and which usually is, but I don't know how come it kind of skipped this time. And
but also speaking about those knowledges that that are sort of like drained, right, or not recognized as human. I think in at least in this during this past, now 5 years, right? We've been primarily looking into the northern hemisphere and very respectfully, we're doing that because for us was also important to reflect the place where we come from, Baltic coast, and also the north from kind of like from Lithuania, and also it had to do maybe well. So yes, we can speak quite much of the knowledge that were extracted and not recognized by by modernizing that land, and much of it was done actually after the Second World War during the industrialization of the agriculture in Soviet Union and collectivization, right? So perhaps we could also find similar histories in Uzbekistan,
yes,
right? If you think of the industrialization of the agriculture, collective, building the collective farms, disrupting the relationships between the humans and the landscape, humans and animals, or humans and humans, also the families, right? Because those, the collectivization and this massive scale, inhumane scale of industrialization touched upon all these aspects and all these relations, right? So when we get back to this indigenous knowledges or autochthonous knowledges, right? Much of it was much of it, was still existing fairly recently, we could say, right? But it was erased as not civilized, or it was deemed as not civilized, or it was maligned, So when we're saying the swamp, right, or the swampian, we are alluding, to this kind of like long maligned agglomerate, or so like assembly of different knowledges.
Yes, I was referring to more the esoteric kind of cultures that would emerge from the swamp, because as I understand, the bayou is slightly different from a swamp. Yes.
No, as I said, we are intentionally using swamp for all kind of like ecotones and wetlands, and of course, we have salt marshes, we have mangrove, and all other types. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions, Sophia?
Hello. I have a more technical question about the swamp game. Knowing that you have a plethora of knowledge on the subject, how was the process of, I guess not simplifying, but condensing it down to the gameplay concept that you had?
Yeah, this moment is always the worst and the most difficult, and how do you edit and how do you pick the detail through which basically you can talk about bigger things, yeah? So I think this is very much of the main idea or main principle of any artwork or any art form in the end. It is kind of like very condensed detail through which you can enter the bigger world. And I think in this case we had we have a bunch of collaborators, and we work quite closely with experts in other fields, like even, for example, a philosopher, Christopas Saborius, is also a co-editor of the volume what we are still working on at the moment, like Swamps and the New Imaginations. So the book is coming up, and we work closely with him. So we are in dialogue with him as philosopher, as someone who also works with the thought. And then we also work a lot with architects, since this was in the architectural context. So we have a discussion, about what would work, what would not work, and then through that discussion somehow, the ideas also crystallize. And I don't know, it's...
I think material itself in the swamp game kind of limits us. We had to reduce a lot of ideas. We had to come with these decisions. Of course, it was important for us to have to allude to the drawings of Karl Albert Weber, right? These kind of queer shapes of the trees, and they're kind of like irregular, and they have this queerness because of the very poor soil, because the peat soil is very acidic, right? And basically these trees grow very slowly, and that's why they have this kind of like shape. Almost the shape reflects on the impossibility to grow, sort of like we have this like suffering, sort of like very weird kind of like forms, and so much of these drawings we try to bring into the what we call the glyphs, and these glyphs is really scientific, almost like collection of the data. So it's the representation of the scientific collection of the data that is a result of collaboration with the biologists working with us for the past 5 years, actually. So entering Swamp Game, you can also go into the menu and you can find the access to all the data, scientific data describing all the species that appear in the game. So they appear as they would appear in the ecosystem. But of course, we had to come with the very reduced decisions when it comes to technology, because yes, we wanted to release it with a very limited budget, limited time, and also limited technology, and this 3GS, sort of like it doesn't allow you much, We also wanted it to be really democratic and accessible without fiddling with much of the heaviness of the data, so it's very instant, It has certain clumsiness when it comes to navigation, which we liked it, so you feel a little bit stuck, like as these architects were getting stuck in the swamp, and their Wellington boots get swallowed, so you feel this little bit when you're navigating. So we want to keep that character, and sometimes some members of the audience, they would like write us messages like, oh, I'm getting stuck, I'm as a plant and I don't move. It's like, where did you see plants moving? Like, okay, trees move maybe, but very slow, maybe 1 centimeter in 100 years, so you have just to be patient. So depending on the perspective that you're acquiring as the species, you would also experience different type of movement, different type of colors, different also scale of the things, right? So we thought that maybe this 3GS was quite, useful for this. Like, we just simply had to embrace its kind of like limitations. It recognizes limitations,
But also in a way, the process is, as you saw, in a way linear. So we start like with the research, we look at the book, we look at the drawings, we start drawing ourselves and, creating all these like icons or glyphs as we call them. And then we have a bunch of them, we have a library of them. And then we see like, okay, there is a need, to present the project online, but we are not interested in just showing photos or videos from the installation. We want to like really translate it into the next level. But what can you do with the material which you have? So you look at this and then, okay, maybe it could be a 3D kind of creature, but not like really 3D complicated creature which you would think in the 3D world could live, but like something, semi-3D in this case, almost like 2.5. And yeah, it's just like, slowly going through the editing and maybe, taking away things which are not needed to somehow, get to the more clear idea.
Yeah, but basically it is, as you may be familiar with the technique, it is just vector drawing.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I like the concept of the gameplay as moving towards as opposed to running away, because I think most games that we play, we're constantly running away from danger, but this is moving towards more information. So thank you.
Yes, maybe I should give a credit to Christopas because he noticed that moment that we should like embrace this idea of being eaten.
Yeah. Cannibal metaphysics, main rule of cannibal metaphysics. No, cannibal metaphysics. Yeah. So the main rule of cannibal metaphysics is to be eaten, not to eat, but to be eaten.
Thank you. Yes.
Any other questions? comments.
Thank you for a great presentation. It was very rich and very inspiring. I thought it was great how experimental it was and how many kind of unexpected accidents you could discover as you go deeper into the research. I see a great potential for pedagogical approach in this and how we think and how we kind of frame perhaps information. But something that was crossing my mind, and I'm not sure if it's a right question, but do you see this information, this research be also used kind of for other applications, perhaps for architecture, or have there been instances where it was used for kind of a different kind of social context or transformation design?
Okay, maybe it will be not so humble to say, but yeah, one of my colleagues from Harvard said that we should use the Swamp School to reinvent the whole curriculum at GSD, you know. So that was like great compliment, you know. We actually were, you know, we conceptualized as artists, you know, and also as artists who are interested in the forms of pedagogy. We conceptualized the Swamp School as a way to rethink architecture education. You know, so we're thinking strategically about architects. We're thinking about our students who's, you know, coming from architectural and studies in urbanism and planning, you know. And we're thinking that you cannot separate those studies from art, from philosophy, from anthropology, from social studies, from biology, and etc. Whether we can take this, it really depends. I think on the we did it in Venice Biennale, you know, and of course it is the, you know, really amazing platform to be not only thematically but also in terms of all other layers, you know, here, right? You know, not only as we mentioned, not only because it is lagoon, but also because it has a biennial, and there is this interesting friction, sort of like, you know, between the two, or the three layers, you know, the people of this town and the town, its survival in the times of the sea levels rising and all the global economies and so on and so and climate regime, right? But in other instances, we try to scale down and take maybe a small chapter of the Swamp School, like for example, like Swamp Radio, you know, or develop or even like rethink and add new chapters, because again, this organization of the three chapters, you know, let's be honest, you know, it was also contingent to the economies. It was also contingent to the fact that it is pretty, you know, expensive to bring people here and so on and so on, you know. So now, like recombining and rethinking, you know, it allows us to restage in the maybe more intimate and maybe also and maybe more targeted, you know, ways. Like for example, we are working on the project in Gotland Island now, and also in connection with the future planning that will situate a water pond system to filtrate the rainwater and runaway water, and again bring it back to the community gardens, and through that also create some kind of like not only ecosystem of exchange but also a habitat for the for many other species, right? And also destination for the you know, even art and research, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely an intellectual system that's very fascinating and that employs many elements that are kind of unusual and unexpected, and therefore the result becomes richer.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was so inspiring and so thought-provoking. It's more like a comment. I particularly liked how you addressed the idea of dirt like challenged the idea of dirt and contamination, like through actually contacting with mud, with all those dirty spaces. As I was thinking about those theories that the decay of Serenissima and the Venice Lagoon in the 18th, 19th century was actually connected to the fact that citizens stopped interacting with the lagoon. They stopped going to the mud, to the waters. And I also thought like of the concept of bioregionalism and the theory of bioregionalism and like the ways how culture and the environment are connected and intertwined. And I think like the swamp school could be actually like this prototype for a bioregional school for like some other environments. And I'm wondering what would be like a desert school, or what would be like a grassland school or other bioregion.
Yeah, no, thank you for this comment. And you know, this brings me with memories back to the end session of that Architecture Biennial 2018, when we all convened in Giardini, and we had discussion, and our proposal was actually, instead of like naming pavilion of Britain or France or US, you know, like instead we should like embrace types of regional ecosystems, you know, maybe the pavilion dedicated to hedgehog, for example, or to grasshoppers or steppe, you know, or tundra, you know, would be much more I think relevant at the time of the new climatic regime, because this idea of nation states, and of course I'm speaking in this beautiful place that is created with the efforts of thinkers and intellectuals behind the Uzbekistan representation. It is important, right? But at the same time, I think it is also necessary, you know, for us to think this idea of national representation, and if we could manage to go beyond that, you know, and think and consider the biotopes and consider, you know, other important elements that were destroyed, and precisely because of our desire to draw the boundaries, you know, constantly, and chop the territories, butcher ecosystems to private interest. So yeah, maybe there would be a hope.
Okay, thank you so much. It was really stimulating, and I think we'll have some food for thought for next few days and weeks. Thank you so much for also having found your time to come here physically and be with us. And I hope tomorrow we can go and visit some more islands. And thank you to all of the participants. We see each other tomorrow. There's a visit that we have communicated to all the official participants, and there is also an event with Matteo Pasquinelli here in the pavilion at 2:30. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.